So you did nearly 40 years in the BBC.
Yes, I think 36 formally, and then I carried on doing some freelance work, so it clocked up about 40 in the end. Yes, 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 it did.
Starting where?
In 1963, when I joined, I was in Aeolian Hall in Bond Street, and that's where I went as a clerk in programme administration, and that was 2 weeks before Kennedy's assassination I joined, which was, of course, a terrible incident anyway, but it immediately threw me into this idea of what happened in a place like the BBC when there was this major kind of world incident happened and things sort of thrown into chaos. So my initiation was a bit interrupted because everyone was dashing about, what they're doing about programmes and so on. So that's where I was, and my job was to monitor what was going on with recordings, pre-recordings. And I don't know if you knew Aeolian Hall, but it had 2 studios, a large studio and a small one. And mostly, a large one was used for things like concert orchestra type of bigger orchestral recordings. The smaller one for more intimate singers, etc. And weekly events included people like Victor Sylvester and his ballroom orchestra.
Yes.
Joe Loss, Edmundo Ross, which was exciting, the Latin American and so on. And this is where I almost came unstuck very early on, because part of my job was to take note of the tapes that were being used for pre-recording. I didn't handle the tapes, but my office was right next door to the studio, so it was a case of picking up the information about what was being recorded, the estimated time, etc., in case of editing. And I had to keep track of the actual tape numbers and where they were to go and what time, when was the actual broadcast date. However, I'm one of these fairly early, I couldn't have been there more than a few months, I think. And we always had the speaker on. There was just one man who was the boss and myself in this small office. We always had the radio speaker on, see what was happening. And one fateful morning, 11 o'clock comes along, long silence after the news. And, ladies and gentlemen, we're very sorry to tell you we cannot broadcast today's performance with the Victor Sylvester Orchestra because the tape has inadvertently been destroyed. That was me nearly under the table, because it was my job to make sure that number was recorded so that typed. Everything was typed, so pre-computers. That was then sent through the internal mail to Recorded Programmes Department, who was supposed to tie everything together for the tapes. And it turned out, it was never actually proven, but I believe I had actually missed putting that number on. And I thought, well, this is it. Now I get called up to the big office. Yes. My personnel manager, or whatever they were called at the time. Well, Dorothy, this is rather a crucial mistake to have made. However, they let me off the hook. They thought I showed some promise and they'd keep me on. And of course, I think what it unearthed was that, imagine that, no checks and balances. There am I, the junior clerks just come in. My job to see the programme was on air, in a sense. And why didn't they check back? If they got the tapes and they hadn't tied up the number, the tapes are just destroyed without checking, so it was just wiped.
Not just lost, actually.
Well, they were wiped, I think. The tapes had been inadvertently destroyed, they said, wiped, cleared. So that was disaster number one. But here I am, after really 40 years, saved my skin.
Disaster number one suggests that there's
there were a couple
number
more,
two,
which were much later, and perhaps come on to those later. Okay. They were not so much disasters as at the time when I had sort of developed my own, well, let's say, skills, personality, experience, and I felt I could speak up a bit more about things. Initially, I found the BBC to be very formal. I had worked in an office before, civil service, so for a brief time. So I was quite used to the discipline of office life. BBC was far less formal than where I'd been before, let's say, but I was made very well aware by the person who recruited me that there were standards in the BBC, and that it was important that you got things right and you had to be careful about what you were doing. And in fact, it's not a discipline I minded, because I think, you had to be able to spell things correctly and so on. I'm a bit of a stickler myself around that. So the training was good. I wouldn't say I didn't sit down in a classroom for training, but there was always someone saying, well, actually, we do it a different way, or we do it this way, we do it that way. So I always found the BBC was actually a very a good place to learn and to get experience and so on. Just then coming up to the other end of the scale many years later when I was in HR work, and something which I remember with pleasure actually, because it was something I really stuck my neck out on. Much later, from 1988, I became Employment Policy Officer, which was a corporate job. A big step for me because it was senior management level. And it was a job by that time I'd gone through being personnel officer both in engineering and for a time in radio and in Bush House. I did about 8 years in Bush House. So this was a job in which the core role was to oversee all processes in the BBC, policy making, are we consistent with the law, etc., etc. And also looking at a big part of it, which developed later on, was equality, diversity. In those days, I don't think we called it diversity so much, but equal opportunities sort of work, to make sure that all our maternity provisions, etc., were in line with what they should be, or in fact they were better than
compliance.
Compliance plus, because the BBC tended to go one better. Our maternity provisions were better. Anyway, within that sort of sphere, when I was doing that work, I had a call one day, and because the role of EPO, as it was called, Employment Policy Officer, looks at the whole of the BBC. So if there was a problem going on in Glasgow, Belfast, wherever it was, they had to come through my office before disciplinary action took place. So I was actually overseeing the right things. Are they complying with what the law says, etc. And then I had a team of people, of course. I wasn't doing it all single-handedly. Anyway, on this occasion, I had a call from a senior member of staff in Manchester saying that he had a real problem on his hands. He had two male members of staff who were partners, and they had come to him asking for some time off because they were going to have what was then called a ceremony of commitment before the time of civil partnerships. But it was a recognised process, I believe, where people who wished to be committed to each other had a ceremony. The difficulty was that the two men concerned worked in the same department or same area, so they couldn't both take leave at the same time. So they, being fairly clued up, as one would expect everyone to be, said, well, look, as far as we're concerned, it's like a marriage for us. I mean, we're not calling it that, but we are committed to each other. We've been long-term partners. We want to be together. We want to share at this ceremony. So they said, why can't we have marriage leave like heterosexual couples do in the BBC? You may remember there was this rather, I suppose, fairly generous provision, but if people married, they could have a week's leave. And they also got a gift, which at the time was £10 of John Lewis vouchers, presumably geared to whatever was the posh store in their region. Anyway, so this couple rather smartly came along and said, well, we feel the same about each other, so please come and have the marriage leave. So of course, this was the real issue put to me. And I said, well, I don't think we can call it marriage leave. Legally, it's not a marriage. I have every sympathy for the issue. And I said, look, is it really so difficult just to grant them some special leave? For them, it's a hugely special occasion. They were both very valued members of staff. They'd been there quite a long time. It wasn't some fly-by-night thing or think of go off and have a ceremony. It was a genuine proposal. So my suggestion was, we can't call it marriage leave. Don't think we can go behind. We can't sort of say, well, yes, they'll get the gift and everything, but let's do the generous thing, do the right thing, because we value these people. We want to keep them, which I think, for me, has always been an issue around HR work. People think it's about enforcement all the time, but I think it's about enabling. What can you do actually that makes your workforce want to be with you? You've got to follow the rules, etc., etc. So here we are. I'm making a compromise, saying, let's do this. So that's actually what he did. He went back to them. However, whether they or the union, I think we're fairly well clued up in the union, someone went to the press and leaked it to the press. And so this was my next big, almost major come down. The sky fell in on me. Hauled up to Director of Personnel's office. What on earth are you doing? Well, don't you think this is fair? I mean, it's special leave. We have compassionate leave for various things, etc. Do you know it went to Board of Directors and Board of Governors?
Really?
Who pilloried the whole idea and said, we cannot do this.
What year was this?
And we're about, I mean, it was into the early 90s. I took the job in 1988.
Yes.
And I stood by it and I said, no, I'm paid to make these decisions, and that's a decision I've made, and I think it's right. And oh my word, I was ticked off. You cannot go outside, we do not recognise it. I don't think anyone actually said, we don't recognise it as such. We don't recognise these relationships. But it got into the press and there was a lot about it, Board of Governors. Of course, in a way, the press was, if you like, in my favour. The BBC has said that this can't happen. Well, it did happen. I mean, they were given the time off, etc. So that was, it was a near disaster of a different order, and one of which I'm really quite proud, because thereafter, because there was an elaborate process of special leave, and compassionate leave and so on, and the rules that were pertained to it, and what you did to qualify. And the special leave issue was always a bit thorny. Well, I would say fairly soon afterwards, within the year, then Director of Personnel said, look, I think we've just got to review this whole business. Because the point was, why are we giving marriage leave actually by the 90s? So perhaps they were more on my side than Board of Governors had been internally, saying, well, this is something we should look at. So we did, and the net result was we removed marriage leave, so nobody got it. So you could say it was unintended consequences. So nobody got it anymore. No gifts, no nothing. But what we did do, and I think this is where I think the BBC has been very good at this. I'm rather proud to say perhaps I was part of it. Is always to say, let's take the broader view. What are we actually trying to do? We're trying to say we have a valued workforce, a loyal workforce. Everyone in their lives at some time has an issue that requires them not to be at work. It may be a sick child, it may be an ailing mother, it may be an ailing sister. There are times when we cannot fulfil the role, but it doesn't mean to say we've completely gone off the idea of working. And I think we've just got to encompass the whole situation and say our managers have got to be mature enough, experienced enough, educated enough to know when it's the right thing to say yes or no. We can set down some guidelines, which we did, around things like special leave for obviously sick children, etc. The obvious things.
Sure.
And at the same time, we were broadening the scope of maternity leave. The BBC provision was much better than the statutory provision, for example. And again, we used to say if women would commit to saying they'd come back after their maternity leave, we gave them a grant to cover, because they weren't earning, they were on unpaid for much. They got the statutory pay, but they were, fairly highly paid people in production, so on, were losing out on quite a bit of money. So we said, we'll guarantee to pay you your full salary. If you don't come back, you have to pay some of it back. And again, I took a view that was actually not the right approach, because this thing, you want to enable people, you want to keep them, you want them to come back. So that was altered, so that we said we won't put that threat there, you've got to pay it back, because it gives the wrong message, it sends the wrong message, that we're kind of holding a gun to your head, you come back or you pay us, sort of thing. So, and I think it worked out in the end, and it's obviously a long time ago. It did work out that the sense of loyalty, the generosity of the BBC was rewarded, which I always believed it would be, if you could take that approach to people. So, if you like, my own career in the BBC, I suppose, had led me towards this way of thinking. Perhaps eventually I wind back a little bit, because after my Aeolian Hall experiences, and the other thing there, which, again, this might not be a surprise, but the boss there, I call him my boss, won't name him, a rather handsome youngish fellow, about late 20s, 30, I suppose. And I remember I was only about 20, 21, something like that. Found out early on he liked liquid lunches. And we shared an office. So he would disappear at 12:30 and 2:30 you may see him or not, And frequently coming in, obviously looking a bit glazed over, saying to me, Dorothy, just run down to the canteen and get me a sandwich, could you? I've just run out of change, dabbing his pockets. Well, the chances are he was never going to pay me, and he didn't. And I got so fed up with this. And I thought, so again, I think I went, it sounds sneaky, but I did go to talk to my personnel manager and say, look, I'm getting a bit tired. I think I should make a change, because this is perhaps not the environment I'm finding most comfortable. So this is when I went off to orchestral management and had a wonderful time there. in the 70s, when I first became a personnel officer, discrimination against women was completely rife, to the extent I was told more than once, don't bother to apply for that job because they'll only take a man. A female colleague the same. Of course, this is when I was in engineering personnel, which was very much male dominated. And I then decided I'd like to step up. I wanted to go to work in news, and again told the same thing. Well, you can apply, but that manager only ever takes men. So anyway, I'm sort of jumping forward a little bit into that side of things, which I think I might like to touch on it perhaps a little bit later. Sure. But going back to I mentioned orchestral management, which for me was a wonderful job because my own aspirations had been to be in the music world. I played violin for 10 years and I was reasonably good at it, and I did actually consider I did go to Trinity for couple of terms on a trial basis. I wasn't really sure about it, but by that time I'd come away from home, was doing this civil service job, but I never quite got it out of my system that perhaps I should have carried on with violin. And I did a couple of terms at Trinity, and they part-time because I was working, and they were very, very good about it. Anyway, the tutor there said, well, look, I think you're good enough for us to take you on, and we'll offer you a place if you want to do it. By that time I realised I wasn't good enough, actually. I was reasonably good in my hometown, but, when you get to London, everyone's brilliant, it seems, and especially Trinity College. And also I was sharing a flat with girls. Again, this is time when I was living near Marble Arch. We were having a whale of a time. I used to have to try to practice every day, and, of course, practising violin. And the other thing that happened, that my teacher there said to me, you show talent, but you've got to change your technique. I actually had a very, very good teacher in Leicester. My school teacher was, he worked in the Amadeus String Quartet, and so he was a man of professional of some calibre. So I couldn't think, well, why? He's taught me this way. But it was like, hold your hand differently, do your bowing differently. And I felt I was rendered a beginner. So, of course, the practising sessions in this flat were grim for the others, squawking away, nothing worse. So I realised not only was I perhaps not quite good enough, I mean, I was fairly good but not exceptional, but I didn't feel it so strongly to defeat this barrier. I was with these girls who were saying, do you have to do it tonight? We've got people coming, and I couldn't afford to go and live on my own. So I made a decision that it wasn't for me, but I carried on wanting to do that. So having got the opportunity to go to BBC, and then the orchestral management job came up, was for me wonderful because I knew instrumentation and so on. So I was booking extras and deputies, and was just so impressed by the Black Book, which had names like Dennis Brain in it. And, I couldn't believe these famous musicians would come and do sessions for us. I thought they were all highfalutin. If you play in the symphony orchestra, you don't mess around doing jingles. Oh, you'll know I'm wrong. down in Soho or come to do something for us for an hour or two. And we had the Goosens family on the list, the lot. It was just wonderful actually, and I loved that side of it. Of course, because I was interested in the music, and that was popular music, and it was the start of the radio orchestra, which you don't know if you know much about that.
I don't know about that.
Well, the BBC Radio Orchestra was an amalgamation of what had been, I think, the Variety Orchestra and something else. What was it called? The Light Orchestra, maybe. Anyway, they amalgamated, and it was a very clever move. They made this one big orchestra, which was the joke name was the Elastic Band, because it could be a full concert orchestra with strings every section of the orchestra. It could split into a jazz group from the saxophones, the woodwind and so on, and it could be a much smaller, intimate, almost sort of chamber group. And it was, so the planning and the allocation was quite complex as to who was doing what and when. And of course, this business booking extras and deputies, if someone was off sick or they wanted time off, and this is a link really with what happened later when I was doing stuff for the symphony orchestra, that I had to know the rules about, session times and the record, rehearse, and what the musicians union allowed, etc., etc. Yes, yeah. That was very, very interesting indeed.
Were you at Maida Vale at all?
I only visited Maida Vale. I was still based in Aeolian Hall when I was doing that job, so it gave me, and I used to go to sessions. Of course, I love the jazz, and I used to go around to those things. So. It was this wonderful connection for me of music of all kinds.
What was a typical season for the symphony orchestra in those days? Because nowadays you might have overseas tours, for example, or certainly go and play in the provinces.
Yes.
But now we have BBC orchestras
Yes.
dotted around, so maybe there's less of that. And there was the proms, of course.
Yes, yes.
So what was a typical year for
Well,
the
the
orchestra?
typical year was there was my later involvement, which is because it kind of grew out of, I suppose, my original experience. In the mid-90s, I was asked to go to radio personnel, working as the assistant chief personnel officer with a man called Chris Story. And my particular project, if you like, was to review contracts across the piece, both for staff people, because there were too many, or at least as the revenue would say, too many freelance contracts of people who actually were self-employed, who shouldn't be and should be on staff contract, etc. And then, of course, looking at the orchestras, the big project was to look at why they were not aligned with staff conditions. So in doing that at the time, the regional orchestras were still very much in place. So Scottish, Manchester, Welsh, so they were still all going in their own right. So that job was to get them together, and I had a lot of meetings with the managers of individual ones. The question about touring is interesting, because that's where one of the big issues arose, in that, especially with the symphony orchestra, by this time, mid-90s, was much development around sort of, if you like, social issues, paternity leave, maternity leave, etc. And those orchestral managers who were dealing with touring said to me, "This is mad. We can't do this. We can't have someone going off paternity leave. What do you mean we're touring in the States in the summer? We can't say, we go home for 2 weeks because your wife's got a baby, having a baby." And I'd say, well, sorry, it's actually not optional. it's the law now. And it caused quite a lot of difficulty. As regards the scheduling overall, I don't know too much about that, because the orchestras were still in place and still doing what they had done before that. The radio orchestra didn't tour, and the symphony did still tour. And that was, for me, on the HR side, I was to try and bring the contracts into line, which was quite a battle. I had a lot of meetings. In fact, the managers actually were quite cooperative, but they were just alarmed. How can we let people go off for maternity leave? And I say, well, what do you do now? I mean, women have babies.
Well, I was going to say, in those days, I mean, when you started, presumably most of the players were men.
Yes, they were.
And then,
yes, exactly.
I mean, now it would be probably 50-50, wouldn't it?
Yes. And there were very few women in the radio orchestra. There were, let's say, woodwind, more traditionally. No brass players, no women there. Some strings, of course, as anyone might expect. But it is certainly true that the number of women was much smaller. But of course, what alarmed them then was saying, well, the men have to have paternity leave as well. You see, so that really put the cat among the pigeons. Yes. That's the wrong analogy to use. So it was a very rewarding piece of work. It went along with work I was doing for radio generally on the contracts front with producers and people who were again, I don't think there won't be any secret in my saying this, of well-known names now, that Gary Lineker and David Gower were actually then being trained up to do announcing. And the bit you might need to edit out is the fact that the then head of sport, called Bob Shannon, who went on to be something quite big in the broadcast world. I think he left and went to Independence. But he took me aside. He said, "Dorothy, I don't know what I'm going to do, because David Gower's a natural, but Lineker's never going to make it." And the rest is history, as we say. And of course, since I came from Leicester, I was had this sort of, well, not a vested interest, but as you probably know, that it is still the case that Gary Lineker's family had a stall in the market, and they do still. And that's quite irrelevant, except Gary was a Leicester hero, and I thought, I hope he makes it, sort of thing. Yeah. So my involvement was that, and it was, as I was trying to align the many benefits that had come in on the staff front, which was simply not in the orchestral contracts. And of course, as I'm sure you know, the contracts anyway were different from staff contracts. They were, I think, kind of halfway house really, because they were allowed time off to do things, to do other work, with the kind of management permission. And one of the things that, coming back to my radio orchestra days, I was taken aside by the then manager and said, "Dorothy, every now and then about once a week or so, some people will come to you and say, Dorothy, I need the afternoon off. And it's usually a Wednesday. And he said, they might tap their nose, but they were not going to tell you the reason. And I said, what's all this? What do you mean? He said, well, it's okay to book a deputy, but they have to pay for it. And it was all good. And of course, I discovered it was Freemasons who were allowed to go to the lodge. And there was an awful lot of it, let me put it that way. So, and I, again, I hope this is not too indiscreet, but I mean, I think Freemasonry now is much more in the open.
Yes.
But it was then very much the people who were getting the session work, getting down to Wardour Street to do the jingles and so on, were getting it through the Freemason connection, I think.
Yes.
That seemed to be how it went. And on one famous occasion, it's nothing to do with the Freemasons, I think, but I was taken to a rather posh ball at the Grosvenor House Hotel. I can't remember who took me, but anyway, some long lost boyfriend, and all dressed up and so on. And one of the members of the orchestra, one of the brass players, had actually asked for time off for the Sunday. We're supposed to be recording on the Sunday. He said, I've got some really pressing business on Sunday. He said, okay, so it was agreed. Anyway, so of course I'm just floating around in the walls and see this man blowing his trumpet up on the band in the stage. So of course I made it my business. Oh, Jimmy, hi.
He knew you
so
knew.
You had to be very clued up about these things. Yes, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. Now, what about the unions in those days?
Yes, union activity was really strong. I would like to know how it is now. Post Mrs. Thatcher, of course, I tried to undercut them all. But it was... my first introduction to it was within the orchestral management side, where you had to be very careful about the timing of these. You could record for 3 hours, had to be an hour's break, and then rehearse, record was 3 hours either side of an hour's break, and that sort of thing. And the union was certainly cut up if there was any suggestion of anything going on longer. In a broad sense for BBC, which I had quite a lot of work to do with the unions, they were always hot, of course, on. So we had three: BEC2, the Broadcasting Union, NUJ, and then the Electricians Union, but the NUJ and BEC2 were the strong ones in terms of anything I was involved with.
But the MU as well.
And the MU as well, of course, yes, MU. Yes, I shouldn't miss them out. MU, yes, they were quite protectionist, as probably is the role of unions anyway, to make sure their members didn't miss out. I don't think during my time there were any actual strikes, withdrawal of labour, as we might call it, within the unions. I don't know if you ever came across that. Certainly that was the case, as you know, with say, scene shifters and the side of a television, when they did actually manage to black the screens, when that was, as we know, disaster in television. You just avoid that at all costs.
Or
except
working
it wasn't
to rule.
Working to rule, exactly, yes. So, I mean, a lot of my work as employment policy officer, it was actually working, if you like, had to be hand in glove with the unions. Not so, by that time I wasn't so directly involved with the orchestral side, but certainly with BEC2 and NUJ, who were very strong. But I very soon realised that it's better to work with them than against them. And I've always said some of my best work was done actually in collaboration with the unions, because you were actually all aiming for the same thing. Following my thesis, actually, if you want the best out of people, you've got to show them that you care and all this sort of thing, and you don't sort of cut them off. So when it came on to what's really quite a significant part of my career, which was all this business about equality, etc., and I mentioned, I think, in my initial piece to you that I wrote the first harassment policy, and so on, that was done in conjunction with the unions. The maternity policy, all that stuff was done by sitting down with them and saying, this is what we think we can offer. We can't go further than this. They'd fight back and say, come on, give us a bit more, and so on. But I do think the collaboration was excellent, and then it could turn nasty, of course. Much tougher on television side, perhaps. I shouldn't say that. I mean, television, because having more impact. If they were going to threaten to black the screens, then of course, people would sit up and take more notice. But in general, issues about the pay round, I remember these huge meetings I used to go to, the director of personnel, and we'd sit and argue the toss, and in my role in Bush House, it was interesting because the unions there, I wasn't quite so much aware of their presence in a way, but because Bush House being this wonderful melting pot of people anyway, so some of people are people, so the issues you're going to get are going to be similar. One particular thing, of course, I'd gone fresh face from engineering personnel where things were fairly formalised and rule books was engineers tended to be of the mindset that they would want to follow the rule rather more than the drama group, for example, if I can put it that way. And Bush House was rather more relaxed. But the controller of the area, I looked after quite a wide spectrum. I had African, Asian, Eastern, Far Eastern and Latin American on my patch. Hugely interesting because, of course, managed to have difference in those people and so on. And I discovered that the hours of work, given the nature of broadcasting from Bush House, which was around the clock then, it's before 48-hour news, so 24-hour news, but it was always 24 hours in Bush House. So the shift times were lengthy, etc. Well, I discovered that they were not paying do you remember what we called toil, time off in lieu? And if you're on an MP grade, a management grade, you could actually take time off in lieu or be paid a certain amount for this. And they hadn't been doing this in Bush House. And I was looking at the shifts and I thought, well, gosh, some of them work very long hours and there seems to be no reward for it. And I don't suggest for 1 minute it was direct exploitation, but it was just always about, we are Bush House and we don't, I remember very well sitting with a controller who was furious because I totted all this up and it was thousands of pounds owing actually across the board, Yes. And he looked at me over his specs, he said, Dorothy, we just don't do things like this in Bush House. And I said, but actually it's in our conditions, they are owed the money. And I found an ally in Sam Younger. And he became MD of World Service in the end, of External Services, and then he went on to be chair of the Electoral Commission. Anyway, Sam was always a forward thinker, and he was then assistant head of the Arabic Service. And a lot of their staff were, as I believed, owed this money. It was a big, very big service, Arabic Service. And I went to Sam and I said, look, Sam, I'm a bit worried about this, because my role here is to let you all know what actually should be done, and obviously I'm not the paymaster, but actually, and he took it up, and I said, I'm not going to get past the controller because he's going to say no, he's saying no. And Sam, forever, I'm grateful to him. He persuaded him that actually they got to change their ways and do this, and of course at a cost. And who wants to increase cost at any time in the BBC, But so things like that were, and amazingly, the unions hadn't been onto that. But
how were people from say the Far East recruited?
Well, this is a bone of contention which will stay with me forever. That right up until the time I left, no one actually, only people who went out to recruit were the senior man, the production, the senior heads of service, etc., etc. No one from personnel ever went, and literally within months after I'd gone, I don't think it was anything to do with me, all of a sudden they decided it would be quite a good idea if so. Of course, my follow-on people from me were flying around the world. Yeah, they were recruited in that way. It was actually, imagine the difficulties even then. I was there in the 70s, 80s. I was there for about 9 years, actually. Bringing people from Syria, for example, it was always a nightmare because they were always under threat. We had people in the Russian service who'd been there almost since the revolution, being wheeled in. Some very old ladies, very, very difficult to manage.
Really?
Yes. The Eastern Europeans, again, it was tricky, always. Russian service, of course. But the thing is, these people became exiles. They couldn't go back once they joined the BBC. And, so they took enormous risks to be there. And that was part of this massive pride, of course, and remains so, of external broadcasting, that you have to guarantee these people are impartial, although they've left their homeland and so on. So recruitment was tricky, and it was a very big rigmarole to get them in, and the contract side, and the work permits and so on. And the other thing that happened that was changed in my time...
there were limited numbers for us.
Limited numbers, yes.
America, for example, was always difficult, wasn't it? You had to have sort of an equivalent number going in the opposite
exactly,
direction.
Yes. And you actually had to... the contracts were usually they had a strange thing, it could be 2 years initially, then maximum 4.25 years, which it sounds very kind of, I'll say sinister. In order to qualify for resident status and be naturalised in Britain, had to do 5 years, you see. So this is a big thing, because people be there for 4 years and then be tipped out. And of course, many of them couldn't go back to from whence they'd come anyway. So that had to be change, but it was even when you were saying this is a highly specialised service, say Hungarian, Russian, whatever, the Home Office was still saying, no, you still got to prove you couldn't get a person from the UK to do it, to get the work permits. Oh yes, there was a whole department having to do the work permit side because they just didn't accept that this was an exceptional thing. And interesting how government works in an odd way, because obviously government was fun as it was funding well service, but no one had kind of coordinated the idea that these people actually need to be here and it's in the Foreign Office interest that they're here. Therefore, you better grant them a work permit.
Yes. Yeah. What about people going abroad to be correspondents? Resident correspondents?
Yes, yeah.
Did you deal with them?
I dealt with things like the medical side. It was absolutely required that they were inoculated against all the kind of illnesses they might pick up. But one or two people refused to have the injection, as you say. They were kind of a bit like the anti-vaxxers these days. And that became a big issue then I worked with the medical officer on that, chief medical officer in the BBC, because we said, well, if you won't have the jabs, you can't go. And this was a thing that comes to my mind, having mentioned that. But their contracts were, of course, regulated by the BBC rather than, because, of course, in some of the receiving countries, their salaries were absolutely enormous compared with the going rate locally. But they kept tight connections, of course, back with World Service. And caring for them was, so we had, as personnel people, we had to know where our correspondents were, and any sort of difficulty or trouble or anything at all, we still had to be responsible for that. But we didn't, it wasn't quite so much hands-on, obviously, as people actually in the UK. But,
what about health and safety in war zones and things like that?
Yes, well, it was, I was certainly around with the first Iran-Iraq war, and looked at very strictly how do we make sure we're protecting our people as much as we can. And when I look now in Ukraine, and I think, my goodness, just some of Lee's Doucette, they're just sort of heroin. How on earth are they standing there day after day with their vests on and everything? Yes. Perhaps you haven't seen Lee's the last few days, but it was a responsibility, of course, of the BBC. And one particular example, which sadly was not in a war zone, but one of the correspondents in Africa was bitten by a mosquito, became infected, and this man died. He was brought back to England and died. So that was, a terrible thing to happen, but it was quite an ongoing case with his family. Obviously, they were sort of claiming negligence and so on, but it was that when he'd gone to an area where there are mosquitoes, and I don't know how it settled in the end. I don't think it actually went into court, but the family were minded to take it to court. The BBC didn't cover him sufficiently with health and safety, but he had any relevant protection that could have been had. But unfortunately, mosquito got him and he died. He was quite a young man. So death in service benefits have always been fairly generous, which is no consolation really, except it's what the families need.
Yes.
I like to sort of put across the message that the BBC was always thinking, it was forward thinking in its policy, even though there were those who would want to hold it back. So you needed people who would push out the envelope, as they say, and say, look, we should do this differently. And one of those things was about death in service benefits, as I've mentioned that. I was going to say you'd be surprised, but maybe not, if there was a death in service, and there were actually quite a few, it wasn't even uncommon. People would creep out of the woodwork you never thought would. And I remember a particular case of a young man who sadly died in an accident, and not our responsibility in the accident. I think it was off duty. But anyway, people like a former girlfriend claiming to be the mother of his child and all this sort of thing would come forward. So there were some real challenges around that. Yes. And we then had a welfare officer, and some of these were quite complex because, you're unearthing things that the families probably didn't even know about. And suddenly, well, what do? We have a responsibility if this child is proven to be a child of this man. But the other thing that happened there was about thinking about death and service benefits, that we, I'm sure you're one of the first companies to introduce the idea that anyone who had a long-term partnership, male or female, but was not married, should be eligible for a pension if they qualified. And when I was first doing the job, it was quite a rigmarole that the welfare officer had to become involved, and you did this kind of forensic scrutiny of the financial arrangements. So you may be a couple have been together for 30 or 40 years, and you still had to go through this rather grisly thing, proving their codependency, in other words, and did you contribute to the gas bills, the sort of questions, which would feel rather awful. It was neat. Obviously, you're dealing with what's ultimately public money, so, well, where the money come from. So the idea of filling out this form, the so-called expression of wish form, meant you could nominate whomsoever you believe should be your beneficiary. And I think now, certainly it was by the time I left, that was accepted as a norm, really, and without too many questions asked. Obviously, there are some questions because, it could be if it's not a long-term partnership, or there was still a married partner somewhere,
yes.
So of course you've got to be careful about the legal aspect of it. But it was a kind of a forward-thinking thing that stop being so nosy about their personal life. Actually, all you need to know is, were they codependent financially? Where are the people involved? Are there any other beneficiaries, and so on? Rather than being quite so moralistic about it. I think there was a slightly moralistic tinge about it.
Did you employ lawyers to look into that?
Oh, yes. BBC had certainly a big legal team, and I used to work very closely with them on all things, and certainly if we were coming to disciplinary matters or dismissing people, it had to be kind of scrutinised by the lawyers. Certainly that was...
Now, at some stage, you went to work for Robin Scott, I think.
Yes,
so you moved up to the sixth floor.
So we've gone from orchestral management, thinking then I think I really want to do something more, and job came up working in BH. And I have to say, one of the things that I have this feeling so strongly still. Whenever I walked into BH, I felt so proud to be doing it. It was such a thing about being in BH. I loved it, And I think it wasn't just about a showing off thing about being in BH. It was actually a feeling that you were at the centre of something really important. And I'm sure anyone who's worked in the BBC understands this, whether it's TV Central or wherever it was, that you felt you were in this place that mattered. And I felt that very strongly. So yes, I went there, and there were two of us in the office. There was a woman who's still a great friend of mine called Shirley Jones, and Robin Scott, he was controller. And Radio 1 and 2 had only just been born, let's say, in 1967, and Radio 1 was put together, from TJs, from the pirate radio stations, etc. And it split out what would have been the light programme into these separate entities. Then Home Service being Radio 4, and only Music, Radio 3. And a terrifically interesting job. Robin was a very dynamic character, lots of fun, and he was very highly respected there. And things happened there when I was, it seemed to me things often happened around the lunchtime when I was on duty. There always had to be someone in the office. And I think one of the things I mentioned, which is terribly poignant right now, that I was in the office when a call came through, and I'm sure perhaps there's still this arrangement that the switchboard then vetted calls. They'd find out if a call was genuine. All sorts of cranks would ring up and say, I am from the police, or so this call from the Foreign Office, which was genuine, and the operator say, I'm going to put it through, it's genuine, we've checked it. And this was to say they wanted us to put out a notice, an announcement on Radio 1 that the Russian tanks were about to roll into Prague. And this was, so think of it now of the Ukraine. And it was in August 1968. And I'd been in the office about 3 months, I think. I joined in June. And I was there on my own. This is obviously this is controller stuff and above. As BBC just does not put out notices on the radio otherwise. And it was interesting that the reason they came to Radio 1 was because apparently that time of day, early afternoon time, it was the one time when our transmission, the airwaves, would actually penetrate to Prague.
Really?
And people were listening to Radio 1 in the afternoons. Yeah, extraordinary. And I don't know the technicality of that, but that's why. It's the only wavelength they knew they could get through urgently.
Was this long wave?
I don't know what it would be. I'm not a technician, but it was... No. I don't know. I don't think Radio 1 was on long wave, but I don't know. And so the idea was to get British citizens to leave. So of course I knew where Robin was. It was a lunch meeting, and obviously DG level this stuff as well. So of course all the but anyway, I was charged with kind of fielding it all, and I typed up the message that went out. I remember that. The Foreign Office issues the phone, and they interrupted one of the pop programs that was on. And we now have a very important announcement to make. And they played Ma Vlast, Smetana. Yes, yeah. And it was very moving, actually, and advising all British citizens to leave immediately by whatever means they can, because they knew the Russian tanks were going in, So that felt massively rewarding, really important. I'd just gone there and there I was, doing that. And another lesser thing, but in a way could have been potentially serious. And this is when the police came on, a genuine thing about there'd been a death threat against Tony Blackburn, who was in the building, and we had to stop him leaving. Don't let him leave the building. We're taking it seriously and we're covering the building. So that was, I knew where he was. There was a big reception going on in the council chamber. Again, so I was sneaking up to Robin, can I have a word, can I have a word? And in fact, we did stop him leaving, and presumably whoever was threatening, either they caught somebody or not. But anyway, he was finally allowed to leave under police escort, etc. And things like that were kind of exciting in the way of thinking, this is a man who's very famous at that time, still is famous, but at that time he was a heartthrob of all young women,
Yes.
But these DJs were coming in and out of the office all the time. Tony, for example, would come in and spill out his heart as he got a new girlfriend and he thought probably ought to marry. But I always remember him standing there saying, I really love her, but it will ruin my image. Yes, I'm the young bachelor, Again, a frequent visitor was Jonathan King, who very sadly probably didn't have such a successful end, reasons we know.
What about Savile?
Savile, now this is a very interesting question. We knew Savile. He used to come in and out, but was never any trouble at all to anyone. Well, certainly not to us, and the other woman in the office and myself, we were young women, or anyone I knew. No problems came to our ears. And I've often thought about it. When the scandal broke eventually, and I think probably, was it Will who was still there then? Anyway, we all got letters asking us if we knew anything. And this is obviously from way, way back. Yes. And I got one saying, can you report anything you think were aware of during your time working there? And I could genuinely say I didn't know anything at all about it. What I thought afterwards, however, was that because Shirley, my friend and I in the office, you see, we were in the boss's office, and he was pretty smart in some ways, although his activities were, obviously he had to be smart to get away with what he was doing. And he was unlikely to have come creeping around us, wasn't he, I think, because of course, we had the protection of being in the controller's office in a way. But of all the parties that went on, I don't think I remember him being too much around there, and I certainly never honestly heard anything. But in the same way, I would think it was I always felt it's quite an innocent time. I mean, I was by that time, I wasn't a child. I was in my mid to late 20s. I'd been around the block a little bit, as you might say. I'm quite experienced, but I felt that the parties that went on, it's actually even when I was in Aeolian Hall, because that was the time, 1960s, remember, the Beatles were coming in and people like that, and there's this huge razzmatazz around, people coming in and so on. But I didn't ever really notice anything untoward. I think we were a group of young people who were just enjoying ourselves. And I was perhaps rather lucky, and I don't know why this would have happened with me, but I always had this sense that I didn't actually want to mix my work life and my private life.
No.
And I'd go to the receptions. There was always a reception when a new, we had the pluggers round for a new record. The man from Decca would come and they'd have a reception. And we were invited to these receptions, have a couple of drinks and so on. But I knew I always went home at 8 o'clock. And it wasn't a prudery or anything like that. I just thought, I'm going home now, But there were probably those, as we know, who did hang around and did actually have a slightly more different take on the whole thing. And one thing, someone I would give enormous credit to was Terry Wogan, who was such a gentleman always. About a few years back now, I was at Glyndebourne and he was there, and I saw him in the bar, and I didn't go up to him, and I rather wished I had, because I was the person in the office who rang him in Dublin to tell him he'd got the job.
Really?
Yeah, he was doing the voice tests and so on, and the head of Radio 1 was then called Mark White. And the girl in the office, Jean and I, were taking these calls about, we want to see him again, we want to see him in person, who's sending the tapes and everything. Yes, and then they came and said, can you ring and tell him, come over, because we are going to appoint you. So, yeah. And I wish I'd gone to him at Glyndebourne and said, you will never know me. I'm the person who told you got the job. And of course, certainly the rest was history. And he was such a gentleman. And he appeared at one or two of these parties. And I lived then, say for much of my BBC life, I told you I lived just down the road in opposite what was the Middlesex Hospital, now long since demolished.
Kenneth Williams' country.
Yes, now Kenneth Williams, I'll tell you that in a moment, but Kenneth Williams lived in the house which is where my hairdresser is now, in street round the corner from me. Yes. No, but Terry gave me a lift home. There was going to be no hanky-panky whatsoever. He was a happy married man. It was just fun. He said, "Oh, you live nearby," and he got this nice Jaguar. He said, "I'll drive you around." I said, "We don't come up there." We had shared a flat with two other girls, you know. He said, "Oh, okay." And he was forever, you know, the natural joker. And this flat was on the 4th floor with no lift, and I can always remember, "But Jesus, Dorothy, you're doing this every day." But he was so nice. He would just come into the door, say, "Well, it's been a very nice evening," and off he'd go. You know, there were no troubles. So a genuinely nice man, and always comical, always nice. So I do wish I'd said that to him at Glyndebourne, just because it was like so many years later, and kind of kudos for me, you know.
Yes,
really.
absolutely.
So, yeah. So there it is.
Tell me about the disciplinary action in the BBC. How did you deal with disciplinary matters?
Well, there is actually quite a strict regime on how you deal with them, and that has to follow the law, obviously. And as it happens, I did 20 years working in the employment tribunals, much of which is while I was still working with the BBC, because they allowed me to do it. I did it mostly in my own time or in my toil days, time off in lieu. I used those, you know, to do the tribunal. But of course it suited the BBC because they wanted a foot in that door. What do we do actually to prevent landing up in tribunals? So that's only relevant insofar as I had, you know, was reasonably genned up on how to avoid. No, we didn't always avoid it actually, of course, but famously not so in some of these equal pay cases. But well, the disciplinary procedure is something that is incorporated into contracts. And this business of incorporation is a bit complicated and a bit boring, really. But when you sign a contract, it tells you terms and conditions and which of the documents are actually forming part of your contract. So it means that the BBC has got to comply with that procedure, and as has the individual. So the idea is that initially you start from the basis like innocent before proven guilty, unless there's something absolutely obvious. So if you see someone smacking someone across the face, you know, you suspend them, and as we saw you do it. But even so, even if it's just a really, let's say take a case of assault, which has happened numerous times in the BBC, believe it or not, whether on or off duty, and of course off duty can be as important as on, because it's about the reputation of the BBC, yes. If people know you're an employee. So in the case of what you might otherwise think was summary dismissal, you've seen the action, someone's witnessed it, and you know what's happened, but you still have to go through the procedure. You still give everybody a right of reply. And that's probably where you become involved. A right of accompaniment is essential, a right of reply. Person could say, actually, I'm really sorry I did that, but actually my wife's just had a serious illness. In other words, circumstances which might sort of justify or at least explain why the person's behaviour was, it might be out of character or not, but let's say if it's out of character all of a sudden. And we had some very interesting ones. For example, I can think of two immediately where and it was a senior man, actually an accountant, who was in dispute with his neighbour about some issue about barbecues in the garden or some such thing, you know, domestic issue. And it got to real fever pitch when anyway, the complaint from the neighbour, and someone leapt over the fence and so on, and they started a fight. So, of course, our man biffed him one, and it got in the local press. BBC account, da-da-da-da-da. So what do you do about that? And therefore, the key issue was whether, and obviously we wouldn't have witnesses to that, although you could call witnesses in, and you say, is it the BBC's business? Well, actually, it was, because it was a breach of trust, confidence. And this is... so. Within a contract, there are express rules, like you may not do this, this and this. You may not steal, a bit like the Ten Commandments. You know? But the implied terms are more subtle. And it's about conflict of interest in break of trust and confidence. Has this person behaved in a way that makes you feel that they are competent to do the job they're paid to do? Does it damage the BBC? And that's a hugely important one in gross misconduct, bringing the organisation to disrepute. And I think in that case that was the line we took, because it was rather a serious business, you know. But here's this poor man who was an accountant who's lost his job over it, which was, you say, it didn't happen on our premises. Something that did happen on our premises, which is one I remember very well when I was in Bush House. There's always been a lot of conflict, and I'll imagine there probably still is within the Arabic service because of religious difference.
Yes.
And the Coptic Christians tend to be in the more senior jobs, or they did. and that was bone of contention with the Muslims. And although ostensibly they'd work side by side and we were quite happily doing so, every now and then, and it was usually during Ramadan. And on this occasion, during Ramadan, there was one who was an observer, and was religiously not eating or anything during the day. And there was someone they had a rather poor relationship, but because the antagonist was always going at this man, needling him, he sort of didn't like each other much. But anyway, he made the point during Ramadan when this man was not eating all day, and so it gets to before the dusk time when they can open the food, sandwiches and so on. So the aggressor, let's say, came in and plonked a cup of tea and a cake down in front of this man and said to him, "Right, what do you make of that then?" You see, and this had been an ongoing, and the man was so upset, and they exchanged some words, and eventually the man picked up the cup and threw it over him, and obviously made contact. So, rushing out, separating him, etc., etc. And then that was a very difficult case because he was the one who threw the punch or threw the tea, whatever it was. So your decision is, what's the right thing to do? Who was the aggressor really? And in fact, we sacked the aggressor, not the man who threw the tea. And rather an unusual decision that, because normally you'd say the one who makes the punch is the one who's got to go. And it was based on, there was no way to get them working in different areas. Yes. There was no ameliorating ways you could actually say, look, we can keep these two apart forever, because we couldn't. And it was a known, they had to be in the same section.
It was unreasonable provocation.
Yeah. But all these things you have to go through with a fine-tooth comb. And in fact, I still do this kind of work. I'm a trustee for Age UK, and I'm the HR advisor. Mm-hmm. So believe it or not, you still get lots of these staff issues within an organisation like that. And all the time we're saying, does this fit with the law? Is this right? Have we done the right thing? It's really based on, innate fairness. Have you listened to both sides of the story? What's your conclusion about that? Why did you do that? What's the employer's responsibility there? Should the employer in that case have separated them long ago? So we knew there was aggression, So that you're saying all the time you're measuring the law, the procedure of BBC, which is based on the law and has to be, against this good old dose of common sense, and sometimes taking a risk.
But you always tried, presumably, to keep it out of the hands of the police or the newspapers.
So, exactly. And that's a very key issue for the BBC, that whatever, keep it away from the press. And
what about, there used to be a thing called waning powers.
Oh, yes. Now comes under general capability, actually. But waning powers, I'd forgotten that, yes. Yes, waning powers. Within the process of discipline and say, ability, let's say, are in a way linked, because you say the key question you ask, if someone's not performing properly, is it because they won't do it or because they can't do it? And won't is discipline and can't is capability.
Yes.
And the two get muddled sometimes, because people's behaviour can be such that you think it's disciplinary, actually then find out, well, they're of waning powers, you see. So that still holds. It's not called waning powers anymore, but it's still quite a strong element in, just to take an example, without any too much indiscretion, against something that's been happening in Age UK. There's a senior manager who is rubbing people up the wrong way, on issues around, quite important issues about the way the place works, etc., etc. And there's a point at which this person really might justifiably be dismissed because of things said to the staff, and staff bringing complaints, taking complaints to the union about the manager, etc. And you look at that and say, well, actually, what's in a funny way? I mean, even Age UK was the same, similarly to the BBC. You're looking at what's the outside impression. You have a large, famous organisation,
Yes.
And do you really go around sacking people, and what goes to the press and all the rest of it? So, reputational damage is a key issue. But in that case, I said, I think we ought to handle it as capability, because actually this manager isn't behaving in a way that demonstrates that she understands her role. She's got to not snap at people and got to understand, etc., etc. So we put her under a capability process. Now waning powers, I think, in the BBC would generally mean, sorry to say, sort of older people, truly waning powers, less ability, less intelligence, etc., etc.
Memory going or something.
Yeah, memory going. Yeah. In which case, the early retirement provisions are very generous. And if you can actually demonstrate that it's on health grounds, for example, there was massive benefit to this because you don't pay the tax on your payments. Obviously, we have to be convinced that it's a genuine case. You don't just say, I think I'll help this person on their way, but actually it was quite beneficial to have a proven medical reason because, or supported by medical reports, obviously, that the person was losing their powers because of their dementia or whatever, because they would then have, but physical things. I mean, people couldn't do their job because of arthritis or whatever. Yeah. It's a very beneficial payoff. And there were things like, do you remember when there was something called grace leave?
Oh, yes.
Yes. I peeved. I never got grace leave.
Oh, I got grace leave.
Yes. Yeah. And there was one wonderful case in Bush House where a woman was given grace leave, followed very shortly afterwards by marriage leave and then maternity leave. What on earth was she doing in the grace leave? So this was someone obviously of a young enough age to be following on. And she wasn't in the office for about a year.
Yes. No, there were wonderful things. I remember M&TI. Do you remember M&TI?
M&TI?
Material and Talent Investigation.
Oh.
It was an allowance of, I think it used to be £150 a year for theatre tickets.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, no, that never came my way.
Remember that? And of course, in those days, if you were researcher or above, you could travel first class by rail.
Yeah.
I mean, it
well,
was
I got first
amazingly
class travel.
generous in those days. But I mean, there was plenty of money in the 70s and the 80s because of the colour licence fee.
Yes, absolutely.
People pouring in. Right.
Yes, the travel thing was quite interesting because in I haven't touched on my last years really in BBC, which were very happy ones because I did so much travel because I was taking on all this equality stuff within Europe. And it wasn't just equality, it was about the Working Time Directive, which was my pièce de résistance, actually, because we got a consortium of other broadcasters, mostly Scandinavians, who are very hot on this stuff, they're very, very arduous in actually, and they do come to meetings and they're very precise. And it was actually saying the Working Time Directive cannot work for broadcasters, where you've got to stop work after 12 hours and all the rest of it. Because of obviously continuing news, rolling news, drama, as you know, all these things. But if you're filming and it's a bright sunny day, you can't just stop because of the clock and then come back the next day it's raining. So you can't got continuity. So all these arguments were put in the European Commission, and I was in a lobbying group, and that was a success. We got the derogation for broadcasters. But you still have to measure the hours within a 72-week period or a 12-week period or something, and then you can sort of aggregate the hours so that the person gets sufficient rest time. But that was really quite a big battle. But actually, it took me, and then it became linked with issues of equality, not necessarily because of the working time, but that was running concurrently, and especially gender issues, women's role in broadcasting. Again, Scandinavians very hot on this, and it was a really wonderful opportunity. I went all the European capitals because all these broadcasters were interested. What I was well aware of always was that my calling card was BBC. It wasn't me, Dorothy May particularly, but BBC, you'll be in the top table wherever you go. And that gave me this wonderful, interesting. I mean, I was working hard. The two highlights, and of course people back in the office thought I was swanning about not doing much. And I never quite got over that reputation. But actually, I was really working hard on getting this derogation and trying to push all the time on gender issues in broadcasting. And one of the highlights was when, it's a very personal thing, but when I was very young, my first trip from school was to Bruges, and I was about 10 years old. And it was for me a major important thing in my life that I knew I would like being abroad, and I liked French, and that's what I did for A-levels and so on. And I wanted to do some work in Europe. Well, sadly, I never actually did on a permanent basis. But one of the events I was invited to was to speak in a conference for the European Commission in Brussels. And you get the VIP treatment. And we were taken as our evening entertainment. They took us to Bruges. And they took us on a canal cruise and a dinner in this fabulous place and so on. And I remember sitting on that boat thinking, I so wish my mother was still alive. My mother was a huge person who pushed always for me to get the things I needed to do what I wanted and do the language courses and do the trips and so on. And I thought, well, this is not too bad. I ended up speaking for the European Commission for the BBC, and that's what they say. That was that one. And then the other one was a fantastic trip because I again, BBC was the calling card. I was invited to join a committee, which was the European branch of the American Management Institute. And they were doing things around European law at the time, which was the thing I was concentrating on all the time. Is that legislation affecting our policy? How do we implement? How do we comply? And so they invited me to join the committee, which was actually deciding on speakers and topics for their annual conferences. Well, their annual conferences were in fabulous places. And the two highlights for me were one in Venice, and I stayed in the Grand Hotel des Bains, as used in the film of Death in Venice.
Oh,
and
really?
I remember sitting on the balcony thinking, this is where Dirk Bogarde was.
Yes.
And the other was being in Monte Carlo, in what's then called the Loews Hotel, Loews. It's now renamed, but anyway, it's the hotel you always see in the car race, because when it goes through the tunnel, that's under the hotel, you know.
Oh, right.
And very big posh hotel where people like Shirley Bassey live, you know. and it had this rooftop swimming pool. And on my day off, I was like this. And when you swim out, you could swim out through this sort of plastic sheeting stuff, and you were smack bang opposite the casino. And I thought, this is not a bad life. Let me do this. However, when those people thought it was at the public expense, it actually generally wasn't, because they paid for me. This committee paid for me to do these things.
Yes.
But it was so they were nice things of my, I must say, the perks finally of you know, but actually I was there for a reason.
Yes. But the BBC was the calling card, and I suppose that's possibly slightly less so now, but abroad it certainly is.
Yeah, it says, yeah. And it still holds sway with, I'm still, and to my embarrassment, I'm introduced to people as, oh, Dorothy worked at the BBC, and this is out in the provinces more. People are less impressed in London, and why would they be impressed, you know? And it does hold sway. Whatever people might say and criticise about the BBC, I think this is still an institution to be reckoned with in a way, and people, of course, are mostly critically, but I think it's still understood to be something, a major part of the establishment, perhaps with a small e.
Well, I mean, the government's always been critical of the BBC, hasn't it? I mean, Churchill was critical of it during the general strike.
Yes. The other thing that's occurred to me in thinking over this exercise today is how, when I started, it was only about 40 years old. And we're now talking about it being 100, so of course that makes me feel it 100 too. But it always felt to me solidly established. I suppose 40 years was a pretty long time, but you think, you know, it was what it was, you know, and it was this mighty place, you know, and it's just a relatively short time, I suppose. The older you get, the more you think how quickly time goes now, you know, but 40 years, I mean, it didn't even occur to me that it was only 40 years old then.
Yes. I mean, I still think of myself as part of the BBC, but
yes.
I mean, in a sense, I am with the Pensioners Association, but a great affection for the place, really.
Yes, I have. It's been a massive part of my life, a huge part of my, and for the good. Of all the times I've been unhappy about things, which I have, maybe about promotions that didn't happen, or being told that a woman couldn't do this, that, and the other. And of course, I look back, why didn't I challenge it more? Why didn't I get up and say? I mean, I wasn't a strident feminist, but I always knew that was wrong. And I suppose in the end, I was able to kind of show them that women can do things. But I must say, it pains me greatly to hear still, here we are, we're talking 50 years or more after I first started looking at gender issues in the BBC, and still we've got equal pay issue going on. And I think what's happened in those years, I think, well aware that unless you actually keep that absolutely live, it will fall back. And subsequent, I mean, I suppose John Burt was not a very great supporter of it, because all the time you were fighting for funding to get courses put on, and so it pains me no end. And I think all that work I did, and we did so much work, I say very good work actually, especially with the Scandinavians, on training films and so on. And there was one very interesting one, I remember it very well, and I think the Netherlands had made it actually, and it was Who Speaks First, I think it was called, and it had interviews with a man and a woman, a couple, who were being interviewed about, it's a real life thing. It was obviously for the training film, they knew it was going to be filmed in that way, but it was about a road being built through a village, and it was going to split off the school, the shops and everything from the community, and it was big uproar about it, and a local issue. And they made a film, and they asked the man to speak. And the man went on and on about, well, of course, this is good for the economy and blah, 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 and so on. And then they interviewed the woman, and they quite independently, and then they just showed this, and you drew your own conclusions. And the woman straight away went into the practicalities, saying, but when they were sitting together, and she kept trying to speak, and he didn't let her. He said, no. And then when they got her separately, because he said he's never going to let her say anything. And she came up with this absolutely first-rate stuff. I'm worried about the school. I want to know what provision the council's making for me to get my children to school. I have to shop. And also, it was a kind of an example of where different points of view, different aspects, which will be there. And why didn't they interview her first? It's a question. They went to the couple and they interviewed him. Yes.
And avoid interviewing them together, because she would be intimidated.
Yes,
that's right.
Yes.
Well, Dorothy, is there any area of your work at the BBC you want to?
I don't think so. We've had a pretty wide-ranging talk, haven't we? Yes, and the twos and fro's. Yes, and I think I have. I mean, only very broadly to say how I saw changes in management attitude. Some for the better, some not so much so. A freeing up of thinking from the more rigid. I mean, when I joined and I was then going up through appointments department, it was still very hierarchical, and men were in charge. Again, I'm not a strident feminist. I'm just saying how it was. And we used to write things. People were applying for jobs, and it was perfectly okay to write things like, which I did frequently. You'd have the form you put on the back. Very pretty girl in blue silk dress from a good family. And I squirm now when I think of these things. But how gradually we've moved to this position of, one day I say the dreaded word woke, how you wouldn't, well, in any case, that was not very appropriate to write. But at the time it was, you see. And I think that's where we have to accept that a lot of criticism about what was happening and then, and I'm self-critical about it. But it was okay to do it then. And it wasn't right necessarily, but we hadn't been alerted to the fact it wasn't okay. So, I think overall, I mean, the other big thing I'd say about management attitude, when I was in my later times there towards the end, I was very aware of the PR aspect more than I had been perhaps across the years, and certainly I have to say within the John Burt days, and you may want to cover this, but I'd sit around in meetings and it was about an issue would come up, very big issue, across the HR spectrum and the general PR side. Well, how shall we present this? And I would stick my hand up and say, why don't we just tell the truth? Pariah, And it's always, how does this look? And I was being a bit naive, but I think we became much more aware, needing to be, I suppose, because of government pressure all the time. But I became slightly worried that sometimes I knew it was a simple truth to tell. I can't give you an example now. It could have finished, it was fine. And it's a bit we're seeing now in Parliament.
Absolutely.
With the Prime Minister.
I was just thinking
that. Tell the truth. Well, better face consequences then, but not run the risk that you're covering the truth, So anyway, that's
and of course you dig yourself further in if you're not careful.
Exactly.
This is what seems to be happening at the moment.
Yes.
Dorothy, thank you so much for doing this.
And it's a great pleasure. I'm really pleased to do it. And and I hope it's been useful to you.